On a serene moonlit night, nestled deep among towering pines, an extraordinary tale began to unfold. The mountain cabin stood silent, its windows glowing warmly against the dark expanse. Inside, Martha Anderson sat wrapped in a blanket, immersed in the pages of her novel, while her husband Robert lay dozing on the couch beside her. Their tranquil midnight routine was abruptly interrupted by the softest of sounds. So faint it could have been imagined. A knock against the window, then another and another. Each tap carried an unmistakable purpose, sending a ripple of unease through Martha as her skin prickled in awareness. The forest had its own symphony, branches scraping, pine cones falling, the rustling of small creatures. But this sound was different. It was steady, deliberate, as though imbued with consciousness. The tapping stirred young Isabella from her upstairs bedroom, her steps creaking on the aged wooden floors above. At just 13, Isabella had always been attuned to the moods of the mountain, spending countless hours observing wildlife from her window. She knew the sounds of the forest intimately, and this wasn't one of them. Darkness pressed against the glass, broken only by Martha's reading lamp. Then from the shadows it emerged, an enormous black bear, like a creature from ancient folklore. The bear's immense form blotted out the stars, its breath leaving ghostly patterns on the glass. Its size was staggering, over 7 feet tall on its hind legs, with shoulders wider than the cabin's front door. Isabella's soft voice floated down from the stairwell, her words laced with awe and fear. Robert replied with reassurances, though his trembling hands betrayed his own apprehension as he reached for his phone. The bear's head turned at the sound of their voices, and Martha found herself locked in its gaze. Those eyes, they held something beyond the wildness of nature. They conveyed intelligence, sorrow, and most astonishingly, hope. The ranger station's voicemail greeted Robert's frantic call. No assistance would come for a bear that posed no immediate danger. Yet this wasn't just any bear. It stood at the window exuding a strange, gentle persistence. They had encountered bears before, troublesome garbage raiders and bird feeder thieves, but never one that behaved like this. Time stretched endlessly, every moment thick with tension, as they tried everything they could think of. Robert's air horn pierced the silence, its sharp cry echoing across the mountains. The bear flinched but refused to leave. High-powered flashlights flashed, casting bright beams designed to disorient predators. But still, the bear held its ground. This encounter was unlike anything they had ever experienced, blurring the line between the natural and the extraordinary. The bear simply closed its eyes and waited for the assault to pass. Pots and pans clashed their metallic symphony, a cacophony that should have sent any wild creature running for cover. Yet their visitor remained, returning to its gentle tapping as soon as each attempt failed. 2 hours passed like a dream. The bear remained, its massive paw rising and falling in that same careful pattern. 3 taps, pause, 3 taps. A code, a message, a plea that transcended language. Martha found herself drawn closer to the window, studying the creature that had chosen their home, chosen them for reasons yet unknown. The moonlight painted silver patches on the bear's dark fur, revealing what fear and darkness had hidden before. The awkward shift of its weight, the strange angle of its movement, the matted fur that might conceal a deeper story. Isabella had moved halfway down the stairs now, her young face filled with a mixture of fear and fascination. "It's hurt," she whispered, voicing what Martha had begun to suspect. "Look at how it moves. Something's wrong." With each passing moment, the truth became clearer. This was no ordinary encounter between human and wild. This massive creature, this powerful force of nature, had come to their window carrying something unprecedented in its eyes. A plea for help. The night stretched ahead, 6 more hours of mystery yet to unfold. 6 more hours that would challenge everything they thought they knew about the divide between wilderness and civilization. 6 more hours before they would understand why, on this extraordinary night, a bear chose to knock. As the night deepened into its 3rd hour, the first hints of curiosity began to replace the Anderson family's initial fear. The bear's relentless but gentle tapping had become almost hypnotic, a strange lullaby in the darkness. Martha found herself studying their visitor with growing concern, while Robert paced the living room, his phone pressed to his ear as he tried yet another emergency wildlife number. The digital clock on their mantel clicked past 2:30, its soft green glow illuminating the room in an ethereal light. Isabella had settled on the middle step of the staircase, her chin resting on her knees as she watched the bear through the window. The young girl's initial terror had transformed into something else entirely. She had always possessed an almost uncanny ability to sense when animals were in distress. "Mom," Isabella whispered, her voice barely audible above the gentle tapping. "I think it's crying." Martha moved closer to the window, drawn by her daughter's words. In the dim light, she could now see what Isabella meant. Though bears couldn't shed tears like humans, there was something in its eyes that spoke of deep suffering. The massive creature's breaths came in labored pants, creating larger and larger circles of fog on the glass. The first hints of pre-dawn began to paint the eastern sky in subtle shades of purple and gray. As darkness retreated, details emerged that had been hidden in the night. The bear's fur, which had appeared uniformly dark, showed patches of unusual discoloration along its left side. What they had initially mistaken for shadows revealed itself to be something more troubling. Robert's voice grew increasingly frustrated as he hit another dead end. The closest wildlife rescue is 3 hours away, and they won't come out until daylight. He ran his fingers through his graying hair, a gesture Martha recognized from 30 years of marriage. They said we should just stay inside and wait for it to leave. But the bear showed no signs of leaving. If anything, its tapping had become more urgent, though no less gentle. Its massive body swayed slightly with each movement, as though maintaining its upright position required immense effort. When it shifted its weight, they could see how it favored its right side, barely putting any pressure on its left paw. As the 4th hour crept by, the growing light revealed more of their visitor's condition. Martha gasped as she noticed something glinting in the bear's fur, something that shouldn't be there. Metal, perhaps, or some kind of wire, wrapped around its massive frame. The discovery sent Isabella flying down the remaining stairs, her face pressed close to the window glass. "It's trapped," she exclaimed, her voice thick with emotion. "Look, there's something wrapped around it. That's why it came to us. It needs help." The bear's eyes met Isabella's through the glass, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. There was recognition in that gaze, an almost human awareness that made Martha's heart ache. The creature lifted its paw once more, but this time its tapping seemed weaker, as though its strength was finally beginning to fade. Robert made one final call, this time to their neighbor Mark, who had lived in these mountains even longer than they had. The conversation was brief, but Martha could read the frustration in her husband's face as he hung up. "Mark says there's been reports of illegal traps in the North Valley. Some of them were wire snares meant for smaller game. If a bear got tangled in one dot, the implications hung heavy in the air. A wire snare meant for smaller animals could become a death sentence for a bear, gradually tightening with each movement. If their visitor had been trapped for days, struggling against the wire." The sky continued to brighten, revealing more of their visitor's desperate condition. Its fur was matted with what might have been blood or dirt, and its movements were becoming increasingly labored. Yet still it knocked, 3 taps at a time, its eyes never leaving the family that represented its last hope. As the 4th hour drew to a close, Martha realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. This wasn't just a random encounter with wildlife. This was a conscious choice made by a creature that somehow knew enough to seek human help. The bear had chosen their window, chosen their family, and now waited with almost human patience for them to understand its desperate message. The first rays of sunrise pierced through the mountain mist, casting long shadows across the cabin's deck. Now in its 5th hour, the bear's knocking had grown weaker, but its determination remained unbroken. The morning light revealed the full extent of their visitor's suffering, a sight that brought tears to Isabella's young eyes and made Martha press her hand against the window glass in helpless sympathy. A cruel metal wire encircled the bear's massive body, cutting deeply into its flesh just behind its left foreleg. The wound had become infected, the fur around it matted with blood and something worse. Each breath the bear took caused the wire to tighten fractionally, explaining its increasingly labored movements. Yet still it stood, Still it knocked, its eyes holding a desperate intelligence that made it impossible to look away. "We have to do something," Isabella whispered, her voice breaking. The 13-year-old had not moved from her spot by the window for the past hour. She watched as the bear occasionally tried to reach the wire with its teeth, each attempt causing obvious pain. The great creature would pause in its knocking, twisting its neck to reach the injury, only to return to its gentle tapping when its efforts proved futile. Martha felt the familiar weight of her husband's hand on her shoulder. Robert had stopped making calls, stopped trying to scare the bear away. Now he stood with his family, watching their extraordinary visitor with growing concern. The morning light revealed tracks in the dew-covered deck, showing how the bear had paced in circles before choosing their window. This hadn't been a random choice. Somehow, this creature had deliberately sought them out. During the 6th hour, they witnessed something that shattered any remaining doubts about the bear's intelligence. It slowly lowered itself to all fours, a process that clearly caused immense pain and turned its injured side toward the window. The movement exposed the full severity of its wound, almost as if it was intentionally showing them the source of its suffering. The wire had cut so deeply that Martha could barely look at it. Yet she forced herself to memorize every detail, knowing that understanding the injury might be crucial to helping. "It knows exactly what it's doing," Robert murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "All these hours it's been trying to communicate, to show us." His hands, which had trembled with fear hours earlier, now shook with a different emotion entirely. The bear's intelligence and trust had transformed their terror into something else, something that felt remarkably like responsibility. Isabella pressed her forehead against the cool glass, and to everyone's amazement, the bear mimicked her action, gently touching its nose to the window exactly where her head rested. The gesture carried such gentleness, such deliberate care, that Martha had to turn away to hide her tears. When she looked back, the bear had resumed its upright position, though the effort clearly cost it dearly. The window glass had become a bridge between two worlds, wild and tame, desperation and hope. Through it, they watched as their visitor's strength gradually faded. Its knocking grew softer, its movements more labored, yet its eyes never lost their pleading intelligence. Each tap against the glass now seemed to carry a weight of trust that made it impossible to ignore. As the 6th hour drew to a close, they noticed blood beginning to drip onto their deck. The wire's constant pressure had opened the wound further, and their time for indecision was running out. The bear's breaths came in shallow pants, fogging the glass in irregular patterns. Yet still it knocked, still it waited, still it trusted that these humans would understand its desperate plea for help. Martha glanced at her husband, seeing her own internal struggle reflected in his eyes. They had lived in these mountains long enough to respect the danger of wild animals, to understand the risks of intervention. But they had also lived here long enough to know that sometimes nature itself broke all the rules. Sometimes the divide between human and wild became less important than the simple act of helping a creature in pain. The sunlight now filled their living room, highlighting the determination on Isabella's face, the growing resolve in Robert's stance, and the tears that Martha no longer tried to hide. Their visitor had been knocking for 6 hours, maintaining its gentle persistence despite pain and exhaustion. As they watched another drop of blood fall to the deck, they knew their time for observation was over. The 7th hour arrived with a weight of urgency that filled the Anderson cabin. Martha watched as Robert paced the kitchen, gathering supplies with methodical precision. Medical scissors from the first aid kit, the thickest leather gloves they owned, antiseptic solution, bandages. Each item placed carefully on the counter represented another step toward a decision that terrified and compelled them in equal measure. The bear's knocking had become sporadic now, its massive frame trembling with exhaustion. Blood dripped steadily onto the deck, creating a dark pattern that spoke of time running out. Yet each time they thought it might finally give up, might slump to the ground in defeat, it would raise its paw once more. 3 gentle taps. Always 3. The persistence broke Martha's heart. Isabella stood at the window, her hand pressed against the glass, where the bear's breath created foggy patches. "It knows we're getting ready," she whispered. "Look at its eyes." Indeed, the creature's gaze followed their movements with an almost unnerving awareness, tracking each trip Robert made between rooms, watching as Martha laid out the medical supplies. Robert paused in his preparations, running his fingers through his hair. If we do this wrong, if we startle it, he didn't need to finish the sentence. They all knew the power those massive paws contained, the strength in those jaws. Even injured, even weakened, it remained a wild bear. One swipe could be fatal. But if we do nothing, Martha responded, her voice steady despite her fear, we'll watch it die on our deck. The words hung in the air, heavy with truth. The wire was cutting deeper with each passing minute. The infection was clearly spreading. Their window of opportunity was closing as surely as the bear's strength was fading. They had spent the last 15 minutes watching instructional videos about wire snare removal, though none addressed the particular challenge of helping a conscious bear. Robert had found his old welding gloves, thick enough to protect against sharp wire. Martha had prepared a sugar water solution, remembering something she had read about treating shock in animals. The bear suddenly stumbled, its massive frame sagging against the window. The glass creaked under its weight, and for a moment they all held their breath. But once again, it found its strength, straightening up with visible effort. Its eyes met Martha's, and in that moment, she made her decision. We need 3 things to work in our favor, she said, her voice taking on the calm authority she had developed during 30 years as a school principal. First, it needs to understand we're trying to help. Second, it needs to stay still while we work. And third, we need to be quick. Robert nodded, adding another pair of scissors to their supplies. I'll cut the wire. You keep its attention. Isabella stays inside, no matter what. Their daughter started to protest, but one look from her father silenced her. Some risks weren't negotiable. The bear watched them with increasing urgency, as if sensing their preparation was nearing its end. Its knocking had taken on a new pattern, weaker but more frequent, like a fading heartbeat against their window. Blood had soaked through its fur, turning its left side a dark, matted crimson. Martha gathered their supplies into a large plastic bin, her hands steady despite the gravity of what they were about to attempt. She caught her reflection in the window glass, surprised by the determination she saw in her own eyes. 7 hours ago, a bear knocking on their window had seemed like their worst nightmare. Now, watching it suffer felt far worse than any fear for their own safety. Remember, Robert said, pulling on the welding gloves, if anything goes wrong, we retreat immediately. No hesitation. He picked up the medical scissors, testing their sharpness against a piece of rope. We'll only get one chance at this. The morning sun had fully risen now, illuminating their visitor in unforgiving detail. Its fur hung in wet clumps, its sides heaving with labored breaths. Yet still it stood, still it waited, still it believed in the humans behind the glass. 7 hours of knocking, of hoping, of trusting had led to this moment. The final hour began with the sound of their back door opening, its hinges creaking into the morning stillness. The bear's ears twitched at the noise, but it remained steadfast at its post by the window, watching as Martha and Robert stepped onto the deck. Their movements were slow, deliberate, every step calculated to appear as unthreatening as possible. Isabella pressed her face against the window from inside, her breath fogging the glass as she watched her parents approach the massive creature. The bear's eyes moved between them, its intelligence more apparent than ever, as it seemed to understand the significance of this moment. 7 hours of knocking had led to this. Its desperate gamble for help finally answered. Robert moved first, his voice low and steady as he spoke in the same soothing tone he had once used to calm spooked horses. The bear's head turned toward the sound, its eyes focusing on the medical supplies in its gloved hands. Blood pooled beneath its massive frame, marking how long it had stood in that same spot, refusing to give up hope. Martha circled wide, giving the bear space, while positioning herself where it could see her clearly. The morning sun caught the cruel wire wrapped around its body, revealing how deeply it had cut into the flesh. What they had glimpsed through the window was far worse in the clear light of day. The wire formed a tight loop, each breath the bear took causing it to dig deeper. The bear made no aggressive moves as they drew closer. Instead, it slowly, painfully, turned its injured side toward them, just as it had done at the window. The deliberate nature of this action brought tears to Martha's eyes. This creature wasn't just allowing their help, it was actively showing them what was wrong. "Easy now," Robert murmured, taking another careful step forward. He was close enough now to see how the wire had twisted, creating a savage knot that the bear could never have reached on its own. The infection around the wound filled the air with a sickening smell, evidence of how long the bear had suffered before finding their cabin. Martha moved closer as well, her hands steady as she opened the medical kit. The bear's eyes followed her movements, its massive head turning to track each item she removed. Its breathing had become more labored, whether from pain or exhaustion or fear, they couldn't tell. But still it stood, still it trusted, still it waited. The critical moment came when Robert finally reached out with the wire cutters. The bear flinched at the touch of cold metal, a low moan escaping its throat. Martha found herself speaking softly, words of comfort flowing automatically as she would to any creature in pain. The bear's eyes locked onto hers, holding her gaze as Robert carefully slipped the cutters under the wire. The first snip echoed across the deck. The bear tensed but didn't move, its trust in them now complete. Robert worked methodically, cutting the wire in several places to ensure it could be removed without causing more damage. Each clip was followed by a moment of held breath, but their extraordinary patient remained still, understanding somehow that this pain was different, that it was necessary. When the final strand of wire fell away, the bear released a breath that seemed to carry 7 hours of accumulated suffering. The wound beneath was ugly, infected, but no longer bound by the cutting metal. Martha moved forward with the antiseptic solution, her heart pounding as she began cleaning the injury. The bear trembled under her touch but made no aggressive movement, its eyes still holding that remarkable intelligence that had brought it to their window in the first place. Robert worked alongside his wife, their movements synchronized by 30 years of marriage as they cleaned and treated the wound. The bear's fur was matted with blood and infection, requiring careful attention to prevent further complications. They worked quickly but thoroughly, aware that their patient's cooperation was a gift that could expire at any moment. As they applied the final bandages, Martha noticed something remarkable. The bear's expression had changed. The desperate pleading in its eyes had been replaced by something else, something that looked remarkably like gratitude. Its breathing had steadied, the painful heaving of its sides replaced by more regular breaths. The entire process took less than 40 minutes, but to everyone involved, it felt like another lifetime. When they finally stepped back, their work complete, the bear remained standing for several long moments. It looked at each of them in turn, its gaze lingering on Isabella's face pressed against the window, then on Martha, and finally on Robert. Then with deliberate care, it lowered itself to all fours. The movement was still painful, but different now, unburdened by the cutting wire. It took one step, then another, each movement steadier than the last. At the edge of the deck, it paused and turned back toward them. In that final look, Martha saw something she would never forget, a wild creature's acknowledgement of the bridge that had been built between their worlds. The morning sun had fully risen over the mountains as the Anderson family stood together on their deck, watching their extraordinary visitor make its way toward the tree line. The bear moved slowly but with growing confidence, stopping every few steps to look back at them, as if ensuring its saviors were still there. Its bandaged wound stood out starkly against its dark fur, a testament to the remarkable events of the past 8 hours. Isabella wrapped her arms around her mother's waist, tears flowing freely down her young face. The emotional weight of their long night crashed over them like a wave. Martha stroked her daughter's hair, her own eyes misty as she remembered the first gentle knock that had started it all, a sound that had transformed from terror to miracle over the course of a single night. Robert still wore the thick welding gloves, gripping the medical supplies they had used to help their unexpected patient. His hands trembled slightly as the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a profound sense of accomplishment and wonder. The blood-stained wire lay coiled on their deck, a cruel reminder of how close they had come to witnessing a tragedy instead of a miracle. "Do you think it will be okay?" Isabella whispered, watching as the bear paused at the forest's edge. The morning light caught its fur, highlighting the silver tips that they hadn't noticed during the long hours of darkness. The creature's movements, though still careful, showed none of the desperate weakness that had marked its vigil at their window. Martha squeezed her daughter's shoulder. "It knew exactly what it was doing when it chose our window," she said softly. "It was smart enough to find help. It will be smart enough to stay safe while it heals." The bear had shown them an intelligence that defied everything they thought they knew about wild animals. Its deliberate actions, its patience, its trust had forever changed their understanding of the creatures they shared these mountains with. Inside the cabin, evidence of their long night remained. The medical supplies scattered across the kitchen counter, the worn spot on the deck where the bear had stood for 8 hours, marking its desperate hope with gentle knocks. The window glass still bore the foggy remnants of its breath, a testimony to its extraordinary persistence. Robert began gathering their supplies, his movements slow and thoughtful. "You know," he said, pausing to look at his wife and daughter, "in 15 years of living here, I've never heard of anything like this. We just witnessed something." He trailed off, searching for words to capture the magnitude of their experience. "Something magical," Isabella finished for him, her voice filled with quiet wonder. She had not moved from her spot at the railing, her eyes fixed on the bear as it finally reached the tree line. The creature turned one last time, its intelligent gaze finding them across the distance. It raised its uninjured paw, pressing it against a tree trunk in a gesture that eerily mimicked its hours of window knocking. The family stood in silence, understanding the significance of this final moment. They had crossed a boundary few humans ever experienced, bridging the gap between wild and tame through nothing more than trust and compassion. The bear's desperate gamble, choosing their window, choosing them, had paid off in ways that seemed almost impossible. As they watched, their extraordinary visitor finally turned away, disappearing into the dense forest that surrounded their home. The morning mist swallowed its form, leaving them with memories that would forever change how they viewed their place in these mountains. 8 hours had transformed their understanding of what was possible between humans and wild creatures. Martha's hand found Robert's, squeezing it gently as they stood together in the morning light. The terror of that first midnight knock seemed distant now, replaced by something profound and beautiful. They had witnessed something rare and precious, a moment when the barriers between species fell away, leaving only the pure connection between living beings who needed and trusted each other. The bear was gone, but its story would remain with them forever. A tale of 8 hours that began with fear and ended with wonder. A reminder that sometimes the most extraordinary experiences come not from grand adventures, but from simply being present when another creature reaches out and asks for help. Experience more extraordinary stories of wildlife encounters that will touch your heart and change how you see the natural world. Subscribe to our YouTube channel to unlock weekly tales of remarkable animal encounters, rescue missions, and moments that bridge the gap between humans and wildlife.